There is so much shame when it comes to pregnancy loss and to this type of trauma as well too, because one thing we know about trauma is that it can really, again, shake our beliefs about ourselves. So now I start wondering, the way that I see things, do they even make sense anymore? I want to try to make sense of this thing. And if I'm not able to share it, can I actually restart my answer to that?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is such a good point because there's so much shame when it comes to pregnancy loss. And I think part of it is because we are such sense making beings. Whenever something happens, we want to try to make sense of it. And because pregnancy loss is not talked about very much, what I try to do then is I go internal. I try to make sense of, okay, why did this thing happen? And maybe I get an answer from my doctor, but many times we typically don't get an answer. So left in that uncertainty, my mind fills with, there must be something about me. There must be something in me that caused this to happen. And other people aren't talking about it. So clearly there's just me in this by myself. And that is such a breeding ground for shame, that the secrecy, the isolation that we live in. And again, it becomes a piece of like, there has to be something wrong with me that this happened to me. And there's nothing out there that's contradicting that, at least not in my forefront right now. So it really becomes a painful place to be in alone.
You write about in the miscarriage map how it's 1 in 4 pregnancies that end in miscarriage. And I think was interesting for me in thinking about like my own reproductive process, that before I had my pregnancy loss, I didn't have a whole lot of sense that other people were having this experience too. But then when I had it and I started to later on talk about it with friends or family members, it just, everything came out of the woodwork. Like so many women are experiencing this, but it's behind closed doors. And that leads to this other question that I have around disenfranchised trauma, which you talk about in the book. What is a disenfranchised, around disenfranchised grief, which you talk about in the book, and what is disenfranchised grief, and how does it influence our recovery process?
Yes. Oh, such a good question. And so disenfranchised grief essentially is any experience of grief and loss that is not readily accepted by society. So that could be something like, for example, the loss of my pet, the loss of my ex-partner. It could be infertility and pregnancy loss as well too. And the challenge with disenfranchised grief is that there's not ready support and resources for us. Already as a society, I think we struggle to accept grief, to make space for grief in our life. And then you add this element of, this is not something that people typically talk about. And then I feel even more alone in my experience. And I feel like I shouldn't be seeking out support. And there's something wrong with me that I'm feeling upset about this, because again, I don't see it in other people. So that breeding ground for isolation and secrecy gives way to shame. And I think disenfranchised grief, it reinforces that even further.
So how do we work with that? Here we have these traumas that are not accepted by society necessarily. It's not something you can talk about at your Thanksgiving table. And at the same time, they're completely dramatically like pulling us under in our lives. What are some of the suggestions that you have for folks in navigating this experience?
Yeah, so a couple of different things come to mind. One being, there's something that's so challenging when we keep all of this in our minds. And while ideally I would love to tell everyone, and I definitely will recommend this, is find that safe person in your life that you feel truly safe and at ease and peaceful with, and let them start to tell them some of these things. Let them know what is going on inside your mind and be able to receive their compassion and their acceptance. And I also recognize for a lot of us, we're not there yet. It feels so scary and hard to hold that I can't let myself do that. So instead, what I would really encourage you to do is even start by journaling some of these different feelings and concerns and shame beliefs. And at times, it's a belief related to shame. If there's more, it's like, I should, that's a big indicator to us that there's something going on here that maybe could be related to shame, to go ahead and start writing those down. And once you have them on paper, so for example, some common ones may be, I should be able to have a pregnancy. I should be able to have kids. I shouldn't be that sad about this. There's something wrong with me that I'm still grieving my pregnancy loss from 10 years ago. Once you have those down on paper, Imagine someone who you really love, who cares about you. Imagine reading that to them. And just let yourself receive the compassion and grace from them, even if it is just through this kind of imaginal exposure activity. So that'll be one. Oh, go ahead.
You also suggest that we should journal about our story, and some of the prompts that you asked, I was kind of like, whoa, that would be intense, right? So for somebody that's had a pregnancy loss, writing things like, or maybe people that are experiencing infertility, writing things like, when I thought of my future family, I always envisioned this. Or when I imagined pregnancy, I thought it would be this. Or when I considered being a parent, I imagined this. And as I was thinking about those questions and answering those questions when I was in the middle of all of that, it would just be really, really, really painful to answer those questions, to even go there. How do you work with people in approaching what feels unapproachable?
Yes. Oh, that's such a good question. And even starting with those kind of questions, those can be really painful to be able to even just go through, depending on what part of the process of trauma recovery that you're in. Something that feels really important with this process is being able to empower someone wherever they are in the process. So for someone, they feel like, oh my gosh, even going there right now, it feels like it would overwhelm me. What that tells me is like, we need to take a step in a different direction, not backwards, not forwards, but in a different direction. Maybe that means we need to spend some more time thinking about how are you taking care of yourself right now? Because I imagine after the pregnancy loss, maybe that changed, maybe that didn't, but let's sit down and slow down and make sure that you are taking care of yourself in the way you need to. Maybe let's check on your connection, your social support, and let's do other parts of this work that are just as important. And then if it feels helpful, we will move to that too. I think as much as we can in this process, empowering people to let them know, we will work on this in the way that you need to. One thing we know about pregnancy loss, it takes away so many of our choices. So it's incredibly important that we try to empower each other and ourselves throughout this process.
And I was thinking about, I was reading those questions and I was like, oh, I don't know if I could answer that when I was in the middle of losing my baby. The question, like, growing up, or the question, like, when I considered being a parent, this is what I imagined. But I also think that we're already rehearsing those questions or that imagery in our head, and so being able to write it out in some way is like an exposure practice. It's moving towards the memories it's moving towards the feelings and thoughts and all the scared, dreaded experience, or it's moving towards the feelings and thoughts that are already going on in our heads. And it seems like it would be empowering for folks to be able to start to write that story out.
Yes, I think that's the beautiful part about the reproductive story is that it's in you. When we decide to tap into it, it's a different story, but that narrative we have of parenthood, of what we imagined our family was going to look like, what it would be like if and when we were parents, that is within us. And a lot of times what I hear clients say, or just friends, family, they only become aware of that narrative when it gets interrupted. So for example, a lot of times I'll hear someone say after they experience pregnancy loss, I never thought this would happen to me. I never thought my life was going to look this way. What you thought it looked like, what you had hoped it was going to look like, that is your reproductive story. And there is something that is empowering. I think you're right about being able to tell that story because it's one that deserves to be honored. It's one that deserves to be grieved as well too. I think one thing that's been really important in my experiences, telling the stories of loss, but also telling the stories that never quite got to come true as well too, and being able to make space for both of those at the same time.
That's beautiful.